the Lake of Shadows. It was supposed to be a weekend of relaxation, a peaceful escape from the pressures of daily life. Ben had been looking forward to this fishing trip for months, a chance to unwind, clear his mind, and enjoy the serenity of nature. He had chosen a remote lake, tucked away deep within a dense forest, far from any signs of civilization. The lake had no name on the map, just a small blue dot surrounded by thick green, but that only added to its allure. Ben arrived at the lake on a crisp autumn morning, the air cool and the sky a perfect shade of blue. The drive had taken several hours, but the journey was worth it. The lake was breathtaking, its waters calm and still, reflecting the towering pine trees that lined its shores. There was no one else around, no other cars, no other people, just the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant calls of birds. He unloaded his gear from the truck, carefully setting up his tent on a small clearing by the water's edge. It was a perfect spot, with a clear view of the lake and easy access to the shoreline. Ben planned to fish all day and then relax by the campfire at night, maybe even roast some of the fish he caught. The thought of fresh-caught trout cooked over an open flame made his mouth water. By mid-morning, Ben was out on the lake in his small inflatable boat, his fishing rod in hand. The water was so clear he could see the sandy bottom several feet below, along with the occasional darting shadow of a fish. The tranquility was almost overwhelming. No noise, no distractions, just the gentle lapping of water against the boat and the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. Hours passed in blissful solitude. Ben caught a few fish, releasing most of them back into the water, keeping only 2 large trout for dinner. As the sun began its slow descent towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the lake, Ben decided to head back to shore. He was feeling content, looking forward to a quiet evening by the fire. But as he paddled back, something strange caught his attention. The water, which had been so calm all day, now seemed to ripple slightly, as if disturbed by an unseen force. Ben paused, his paddle held above the water, and scanned the surface. For a moment, he thought he saw a dark shape moving beneath the boat, something large and slow. But when he blinked, it was gone, leaving only the clear water and his reflection staring back at him. Shrugging it off as a trick of the light, Ben continued paddling. Yet, the uneasy feeling lingered, a nagging sense that something was watching him. He quickened his pace, eager to reach the safety of the shore. By the time he arrived back at his campsite, the sun had dipped below the treetops, and the sky was painted in hues of orange and pink. He pulled the boat up onto the shore and secured it to a tree before heading to his tent to start the fire. As he worked, the unsettling feeling from the lake still gnawed at him, though he tried to push it aside. The fire crackled to life, sending sparks into the darkening sky. Ben skewered the fish and set them over the flames, savoring the smell as they cooked. The warmth of the fire and the comforting routine of preparing his meal helped ease his nerves, and he began to relax once more. Night fell quickly in the forest, the stars appearing in a brilliant display overhead. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, and Ben couldn't help but feel a pang of loneliness. After finishing his meal, Ben settled into a folding chair by the fire, staring into the flames as they danced and flickered. The warmth was soothing, and soon his eyes grew heavy. Just as he was about to drift off to sleep, he heard a splash, faint but distinct, coming from the lake. Ben's eyes snapped open, his body tensing. He listened intently, but the sound didn't come again. He told himself it was probably just a fish, maybe a beaver, but something about the splash had sounded different, heavier, almost deliberate. He shook his head, chuckling nervously to himself. "Get a grip, Ben," he muttered, rubbing his eyes. "You're out here alone. Your mind's just playing tricks on you." But deep down, he knew it was more than that. The unease that had started on the lake earlier that day was growing stronger, gnawing at the edges of his mind. He tried to shake it off, to tell himself that there was nothing out there in the dark, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Deciding it was best to turn in for the night, Ben doused the fire with water, watching the embers sizzle and die out. The darkness closed in around him, the comforting light of the flames now gone, leaving only the faint glow of the stars and the moon to guide him. He climbed into his tent, zipping it up tightly behind him. The inside was warm and cozy, and he crawled into his sleeping bag, hoping that sleep would come quickly and chase away the strange thoughts. But as he lay there in the silence, every rustle of leaves, every creak of the trees seemed magnified, echoing in his ears like the beating of a drum. Ben squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the sounds, but then he heard it again, the splash, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of something moving through the water. His heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline surging through his veins. He strained to listen, trying to determine what it was, but the noises stopped as suddenly as they had begun. For a long time, Ben lay there, wide awake, his senses on high alert. But the night remained silent, and eventually exhaustion overtook him, pulling him into a fitful sleep. He didn't know how long he had been asleep when he woke to a soft, rhythmic sound, like the gentle lapping of water against the shore. He blinked groggily, trying to orient himself, but as he became more aware, he realized the sound wasn't coming from the lake. It was closer, much closer. It was coming from inside the tent. Ben froze, every muscle in his body tensing as the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was a wet, squelching noise, like something dragging itself across the floor. His heart hammered in his chest, and he fought to keep his breathing steady, terrified of making a sound. Slowly, ever so slowly, he turned his head towards the noise. In the darkness of the tent, he could just make out a large, dark mass moving slowly along the ground, leaving a trail of wetness in its wake. It was too dark to see clearly, but whatever it wasn't human. Panic seized Ben, and he fought the urge to scream. He had to get out, had to get away from whatever was in the tent with him. But his body refused to move, paralyzed by fear as the thing continued to slither closer. Finally, summoning every ounce of strength he had, Ben threw himself towards the tent's zipper, fumbling with it in the dark. His fingers slipped on the metal, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the thing drew nearer. The zipper finally gave way, and Ben burst out of the tent, tumbling onto the cold, damp ground. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes wild as he looked back at the tent. The shadow inside shifted, slowly rising up, its form becoming more distinct in the pale light of the moon. It was humanoid, but not quite. The creature was tall, with elongated limbs and a body that seemed to shimmer with moisture. Its skin was dark and slick, like the surface of the lake, and its eyes, if they were eyes, glowed faintly in the darkness. For a moment, the two of them just stared at each other, Ben frozen in terror, the creature's glowing gaze fixed on him. Then, with a speed that defied its size, the creature lunged towards him. Ben turned and ran, his feet slipping on the wet leaves as he sprinted towards the truck. His mind was screaming at him to get away, to put as much distance between himself and that thing as possible. He could hear it behind him, its movements wet and slithery, like something half-formed, struggling to maintain its shape. He reached the truck, wrenching the door open and throwing himself inside. His hands shook as he fumbled for the keys, dropping them in his panic. He snatched them up from the floor, his breath coming in frantic gasps as he shoved the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and Ben slammed his foot on the gas, tearing out of the clearing and onto the narrow dirt road that led back to the highway. He didn't dare look back, his entire focus on getting as far away from that lake as possible. As he drove, his mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. The creature, the noises, the feeling of being watched, it all defied explanation. But one thing was certain: he had encountered something out there, something ancient and malevolent, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. The road twisted and turned through the forest, the trees looming over him like dark sentinels. Every shadow, every flicker of movement in his peripheral vision sent a jolt of fear through him. He kept expecting to see the creature's glowing eyes in his rearview mirror, but the road remained empty. After what felt like an eternity, the dirt road gave way to pavement, and Ben sped onto the highway, his heart still pounding in his chest. He didn't stop until he reached the outskirts of the nearest town, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. It was only then, in the safety of the well-lit streets, that he allowed himself to slow down, pulling into the parking lot of a small diner. He sat there for a long time, the engine idling, his mind replaying the events of the night over and over. Eventually, he turned off the engine and leaned back in his seat, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. He knew he wouldn't sleep, not tonight, not for a long time. The image of the creature, its dark, slick form rising from the floor of the tent, was burned into his mind. Ben never returned to that lake. He couldn't bring himself to go back, not after what he had seen, what he had felt. He tried to forget, to push the memories away, but they lingered, haunting him in his dreams and in the quiet moments when he was alone. He told a few friends about the experience, but they all laughed it off, saying he must have been dreaming, or that it was just a trick of the light. But Ben knew the truth. He had felt its presence, seen it with his own eyes. The lake wasn't just a peaceful, secluded spot in the woods. It was something far darker, far more sinister. And somewhere, deep in that forest, the creature still lurked, waiting for its next unsuspecting visitor to come along. The cursed waters. For as long as anyone could remember, the small town of Red Hollow had been surrounded by an air of mystery. Nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains, it was a place forgotten by time, where old superstitions lingered, and the past was never quite buried. The locals were a quiet, reserved bunch, and outsiders rarely ventured there. But what drew the most curiosity and fear was the lake just outside of town. The lake, known to the locals as Blackwater Lake, was infamous. It was said to be cursed, and few dared to visit its shores, let alone fish its waters. The stories varied, passed down through generations, but all shared the same grim warning: the lake took more than it gave. Jack, a seasoned fisherman and outdoor enthusiast, had heard the stories about Blackwater Lake, but he didn't believe in curses. He was a practical man, more concerned with the quality of his gear and the best spots to catch bass than with old wives' tales. So when he stumbled upon an old map showing the location of the lake, he saw it as an opportunity. The map was tucked away in a dusty corner of a second-hand bookstore in a neighboring town. Jack had been looking for new fishing spots, and the lake, remote and untouched, seemed like the perfect challenge. He asked the shopkeeper about it, but the old man had only shaken his head, Muttering something about the lake being best left alone, Jack had smiled, paid for the map, and left without a second thought. The drive to Red Hollow was long and winding, the roads growing narrower and more overgrown as he neared his destination. The town itself was small, with only a few scattered buildings and a single main street. The locals watched him with wary eyes as he drove through, but Jack paid them no mind. He was focused on the lake. He followed the map's directions, which led him out of town and up into the hills. The road eventually turned to dirt, then to a barely there trail. Jack's truck bounced and jolted over the uneven ground, but he pressed on, determined to reach the lake. After what felt like hours, the trees finally parted, revealing the lake. It was larger than Jack had expected, its dark waters stretching out before him, surrounded by thick, ancient forest. The lake's surface was perfectly still, reflecting the sky and trees like a dark mirror. There was something about it that gave Jack pause, a sense of foreboding that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, but he shook it off, attributing it to the eerie silence that surrounded the place. He parked the truck near the shore and unloaded his gear. The air was cool, with a faint mist hovering over the water, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Jack's plan was simple: fish for a few hours, see if the lake was as good as it looked, and then head back before nightfall. He set up his fishing rod and cast his line into the water, watching as the lure disappeared into the inky depths. For a while, nothing happened. The lake remained still, almost unnaturally so, with no sign of fish or even the usual insects buzzing near the surface. Jack frowned, his initial excitement beginning to wane. But just as he was about to reel in his line and try another spot, he felt a tug. It was strong, almost too strong, and Jack's heart raced as he began to reel it in. Whatever was on the other end of the line was heavy, putting up a fight like nothing he had ever encountered before. He braced himself, his muscles straining as he pulled, but the line held firm. Suddenly, the tension eased, and the line went slack. Jack cursed under his breath, thinking the fish had gotten away, but as he reeled in the line, he realized something was still there. It wasn't the fish he had expected, but a large, waterlogged object, dark and misshapen, tangled in the line. Curiosity piqued. Jack leaned over to inspect his catch. As he dragged it onto the shore, he saw that it was a piece of wood, or at least it had been at one time. It was rotted and covered in a thick layer of algae and mud, but what caught Jack's attention was the markings, faint, weathered carvings that ran along its surface. They were symbols he didn't recognize, worn by time and water, but they seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. A shiver ran down Jack's spine as he touched the wood, feeling the cold, slimy texture against his fingers. There was something unsettling about it, something that made him want to toss it back into the lake and forget he had ever seen it. But his curiosity got the better of him, and he set it aside, intending to examine it later. He cast his line again, determined to catch something, but the unease lingered. The lake seemed darker now, its waters less inviting, more ominous. The sun, which had been shining brightly when he arrived, was now hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, casting the area in a dull, gray light. Jack caught nothing for the rest of the afternoon. The lake was silent, devoid of life, as if whatever had once thrived there was long gone. By late afternoon, he decided to call it a day. He packed up his gear, glancing nervously at the piece of wood he had found. The carvings seemed more distinct now, almost as if the symbols had been etched deeper into the wood since he first pulled it out of the water. As he loaded everything into the truck, he debated whether to take the wood with him or leave it behind. But something about it compelled him to keep it, as if the lake was daring him to take a piece of it with him. He placed it in the bed of the truck, covering it with a tarp, and started the engine. The drive back to Red Hollow was uneventful, but the sense of unease grew stronger the closer he got to town. The forest, which had seemed lush and vibrant on the way in, now felt oppressive, the trees closing in around the narrow road like a tunnel. By the time Jack reached the town, the sky was darkening, and a heavy fog was rolling in, swallowing the landscape in a thick, ghostly mist. He stopped at the only diner in town, hoping to grab a bite before heading home. The place was small and dimly lit, with a few locals huddled in booths, speaking in hushed tones. When Jack walked in, the conversation stopped, and all eyes turned to him. Ignoring the stares, Jack took a seat at the counter and ordered a coffee. The waitress, an older woman with a stern expression, poured him a cup, her eyes narrowing as she noticed the mud on his boots. "Been out to the lake, have you?" she asked, her tone laced with suspicion. Jack nodded. "Yeah, figured I'd try my luck. Didn't catch much though." The woman's face tightened, and she leaned in closer, her voice low. "You shouldn't be messing around out there, stranger. That lake's no place for outsiders." Jack raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean? It's just a lake." The woman shook her head, her eyes darting nervously towards the other patrons. "You don't understand. That lake's cursed. It's taken people, good people, and it'll take you too if you're not careful." Jack frowned, remembering the strange carvings on the piece of wood. "Taken people? What are you talking about?" The woman glanced around again, then leaned in even closer. "There are things in that lake, things that shouldn't be disturbed. It's been cursed for generations. People who go there, they don't come back the same, if they come back at all." Before Jack could respond, the door to the diner swung open, and an old man walked in, his face weathered and worn, with eyes that seemed to have seen too much. The room fell silent as he approached the counter, his gaze fixed on Jack. "You've been to the lake," the old man said, his voice raspy. It wasn't a question. Jack nodded slowly. "Yeah, I was fishing." The old man's expression darkened. "You need to leave. Now, take whatever you found and get as far away from here as you can." Jack was taken aback by the intensity of the man's words. "What's going on? What's so bad about that lake?" The old man didn't answer right away. He looked down at the counter, his hands trembling slightly. "That lake, it's a gateway, a place where the veil between our world and something else is thin. People have been drawn there for centuries, and every time, something comes back with them, something evil." A chill ran down Jack's spine as he remembered the strange carvings on the wood, the unnatural stillness of the lake, and the feeling that he was being watched. What kind of evil? The old man looked up, his eyes filled with a deep, haunting sorrow. "It's not something you can understand. It takes different forms, but it's always the same something ancient, something that feeds on fear, on life itself. If you've taken anything from that lake, you need to get rid of it. Destroy it, bury it, whatever you can do. But don't take it with you." Jack hesitated, the weight of the old man's words settling heavily on his shoulders. He thought of the piece of wood in the back of his truck, the strange carvings that seemed to pulse with an energy he couldn't explain. "I found something, a piece of wood with carvings on it." The old man's face paled, and the room grew colder. "You need to destroy it now, before it's too late." Without another word, Jack threw some money on the counter and rushed out of the diner, the old man's warning echoing in his ears. The fog outside had thickened, making it difficult to see more than a few feet in front of him. He made his way to the truck, his heart pounding in his chest. When he reached the truck, he pulled back the tarp and stared at the piece of wood. The carvings were more pronounced now, the symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. Jack's hands shook as he lifted the wood, feeling the cold, unnatural energy radiating from it. He knew he couldn't keep it. Whatever it was, whatever it represented, it had to be destroyed. But as he turned to toss it into the nearby woods, a low, guttural sound filled the air, a sound that seemed to come from all around him, vibrating through the fog. Jack froze, his breath catching in his throat. The sound grew louder, more menacing, like the growl of some unseen beast. He glanced around, his eyes straining to see through the thick mist. But there was nothing, only the oppressive silence of the night. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. Something dark and twisted, just beyond the edge of the fog, slithering towards him. Jack's blood ran cold as he realized the truth. The old man had been right. He had brought something back with him, something that didn't belong in this world. Without thinking, Jack hurled the piece of wood into the woods, watching as it disappeared into the darkness. The growling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press in from all sides. Jack stood there for what felt like an eternity, his body tense, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The fog slowly began to lift, the air growing warmer, more normal. Jack took a shaky breath, then hurried back to the truck, his hands still trembling. He started the engine and peeled out of the parking lot, not daring to look back. As he drove away, the weight of what he had experienced settled heavily on him. He knew he couldn't tell anyone, not the full truth anyway. They wouldn't believe him. But he also knew he could never go back to that lake, never tempt fate again. Jack drove through the night, not stopping until he was miles away from Red Hollow, from the cursed waters of Blackwater Lake. And though he tried to forget, tried to move on, the memories lingered, haunting him in the quiet moments, in the dark corners of his mind. He never returned to that lake. And whenever he was alone at night, in the stillness of the wilderness, he couldn't help but listen for the faint, distant growl of something ancient, something that had crossed over from the other side, waiting, watching, hungry for the next soul to wander too close.